Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
There might be danger on the horizon, and it could involve your wallet. COVID-19 has plunged most of the world into a recession, but government stimulus packages and consumer optimism have made for some counterintuitive statistics. Retail sales paint a confusing picture of what lies ahead for your personal finances, and our nation's output has been significantly reduced. What will all of this mean for your personal finances? And is there anything you can do to prepare? In the first segment of today's episode, we'll look at what is happening with retail sales. And in the second segment, we'll get to speak with Joe Minarik, the former chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget. He'll help us understand what the future might bring and how each of us can prepare for it. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on retail sales and the economy without
TrueChat's senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Okay, stay with us, folks. Don't lose us on GDP, all right? Stay with us because it's going to focus on how it affects you personally. And not only do Justin and I have some insight, but if you've listened to the show before, Joe is a great speaker and will be able to put all of this and stuff that we can understand. But, just looking at our article today, Justin, we all understand, I think, if we paid any attention, that things like the airlines and entertainment and hotels, fewer people are going, right? Fewer people are flying, fewer people are going staying in hotels. So their sales are going down. Yet we have things like, Amazon and, Walmart, places that have been able to lock into the delivery systems, have seen a growth in revenue. So, the numbers are they're not a true representation maybe of the entire economy, because we have some parts of the economy that have grown very rapidly, and we have others like the entertainment industry and bars and restaurants and, people who work in that industry are seeing nothing. And they're saying, what do you mean? Why do I care that Amazon's growing 40%? Because I don't have a job, or like in our state, bars are closing at an early hour. I mean, it's just, they're limited with seating capacity. And, my wife and I were talking about this the other day, just quickly, we're not Southern California. They can have outdoor seating pretty much all year round in bars and restaurants. And by the time you get to October or November, it's pretty cold up here in the Midwest and in the Northeast to have outdoor seating. So what's going to happen to these industries come wintertime if the pandemic is still showing its ugly teeth?
People are paying attention to this because there is a lot of uncertainty in each of our economic futures, whether that's things like what you brought up, whether or not you're even going to be able to go to a restaurant, depending on the part of the country you live in, depending on what happens as the year progresses here for places where the weather makes it a little less feasible to do things like eating outside, all the way to where you shop, to even things like your job. So there's a lot of different ways, depending on what sector you're in, it could be affecting. And if you lose your job, the ones that are doing well are obviously also going to have an impact on where you might be able to get a new job. So if your industry overall was hit pretty bad, you may be having to look at a different industry. And actually, we just talked about that on a recent episode that people change jobs more frequently, but they usually stay in the same industry. And when you have to shift industry, that's where you get into this. It becomes a real challenge for people because they're probably going to take a pretty substantial pay cut, unless they can get into something that utilizes, their past experience pretty heavily. And like you mentioned, what we've heard, right, from a lot of different sources, but this one's from the Wall Street Journal, is that overall revenue, and this is key, revenue for the companies in the S&P 500 index is on track to fall 9.2% year over year for the most recently completed quarter. That'd be the second quarter, based on actual results and estimates for those companies that are yet to report. That is below the 5-year average revenue growth of 3.7%. Okay. But when you look, Lance, right, at this nice chart, and that's part of why I chose this article. You look at this nice chart that we got at the top of the Wall Street Journal article. And remember, for our listeners, if you'd like to see this, it's at thestateofus.org. It's linked. Scroll to the bottom of the page, look for the episode title. You'll find it right there, thestateofus.org. When you look at this chart, Lance, you can see it. This is the mixed picture, right? That we're talking about that I discussed in the opening, the thing that feels counterintuitive. We go into this big shutdown and yet there's all these places. Basically what we're looking at is we have dots plotted on a chart, right? And those to the right are ones that are doing well, and those to the left are the ones that are doing poorly. And it really is a pretty mixed bag. There's some that have done very well as a result of what's going on, and some that have done very bad. And you picked out a couple of those prime examples, both with Amazon and the airlines. The airlines obviously being one that saw a decline of 88% from a year ago, and Amazon seeing a revenue growth of 40% overall. So it's interesting how you've got those two dynamics going back and forth.
How's it going to affect those of you in the younger generation? How's it going to affect Gen Z and the millennials? And then how's it going to affect Gen X, which is kind of there in the middle, and me, the boomer? What's this do for me as I'm retired, but still dabbling in part-time jobs and those kinds of things? How's this going to affect my retirement, and the last years of my life? This obviously isn't the way I expected to do things as I approached retirement. But for you as a young businessman getting started, how does this affect you for the next 3 to 5 years? And how do the next 3 or 5 years, how will they affect you when you finally get to my age? Because I'm not going to get any older. I'm just going to stay here. So eventually you'll catch up to me, and so what's your journey going to be like? And for our producers, as they come up through the ranks.
So you're not getting any older, Lance? Has that been decided?
Oh, heck no.
Okay. You're just
not
cutting it off now.
That's my plan. Right. I've already written that in there that I'm not getting any older. I'll just stay right here, wait for you guys to catch up. But, it really does. This economy affects different people differently. And that's part of today's show. At least that's what we're planning on doing, yes, okay, the overall economy, but how does it affect you individually at your stage of life? Are you just getting started? Are you a millennial?
And that's part of what we're going to have Joe Minarik in the second segment kind of speak to, because I think, Lance, right, you and I, and part of the reason we wanted to do this episode is you and I think, pay closer attention to a lot of the financial stuff going on, or we try to probably than your average person, but are no means, we're not experts either, so Lance and I, we kind of watch the stock market and we do that, couch investing, sort of mentality where we talk about it a little bit here or there. But as we think about, because Lance and I try to be, pretty proactive with our finances, I think on a personal level, and you tell me if I'm saying anything you disagree with, Lance, but I think you and I try to look out there and say, okay, what's the smartest thing to plan for? And when you have something like COVID going on, that's really tough. Because, if you're in retirement, you may still be getting your check, but how are you spending money differently, right? How are you consuming products differently? And if you're in the workforce, are you even going to get to keep your job? And so how do you plan when so much of the future is uncertain? And that's kind of why we want to talk with Joe.
All I would add to what you said is, what are the strategies in these uncertain times? Because I've had a little bit of experience in uncertain times. I remember the recession in the 80s and some different things, in 07 and 08. But for the younger generations, this might be the first time that you've seen a struggling economy. You could jump from job to job because everybody was looking for workers. Now all of a sudden the job market has tightened up. And so now what are some strategies that you have moving forward? What should your short-term goals be? What are your long-term goals, and how do you plan for that future?
So we've looked so far, Lance, at retail sales in the age of COVID, kind of what's been going on there, the winners and losers, right, of what's going on. Those companies that were well positioned to serve people who were staying at home, they've done particularly well. And those that were not have fared far worse, or the ones that are just in areas of the economy where if people aren't going out, it's just, it doesn't matter because you can't serve people at home because of the nature of your industry. But there's a lot of questions that still remain. We've talked about a few of them, but we're going to go for some answers. What is all of this going to mean for your finances at home? And is there anything that you can do to prepare? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today, we've been talking about how retail sales paint a confusing picture of what lies ahead for your personal finances.
We are now going to look at our nation's economic output, and we are joined by Joe Minarik. Joe served as the chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget for the 8 years of the Clinton administration and served as chief economist to the House Budget Committee. Currently, Joe works for the Committee for Economic Development in Washington, D.C. Joe, thank you for your time and thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here.
So, Joe, for a lot of people, GDP or gross domestic product, that doesn't mean very much, right? Even if we say it dropped by more than 30% in the United States in the second quarter, and that's a loaded statistic in and of itself, which I'm sure you're going to help us understand, people may not really get the significance of a drop, right? Even if it's just 9%. Why is that so significant? So help us understand what GDP is in the first place, and how does it affect each of our listeners at home, you and me personally?
Gross domestic product is the sum and total of all of the goods and services that we produce as a nation. So it is a proxy for our income. It's not a complete measure of our income because it does not include transfer payments that people receive from government. So for seniors, it does not include Social Security benefits. For low-income people, it does not include benefits of SNAP or what used to be called food stamps. So it's not a complete measure of our income, but for those of us who are working, it is an indication collectively of what we have earned. The fact that the gross domestic product declined as much as it did in the second quarter of this year is an indication of how much our production as a society fell because of the locking down of the economy that we had to do with the coronavirus pandemic. So that means that in that second quarter, we had a lot less income spent, and the disparity that you're pointing out, which I think we probably are going to want to talk about, is the difference between relatively robust retail sales and a big decline in our gross domestic product, which is to say the income that we're getting from the producing that we're doing. So that's a big story.
Exactly, and that's you led right into it. Like you just said, retail sales seem to be rebounding, even though they took a big hit in the second quarter. I mean, they're still below the normal growth averages for the last few years, but they've really rebounded pretty well. But should we be concerned that the massive drop in GDP relative to the rebounding retail sales? And are we as consumers spending money that we really don't have, or are we doing the right things?
The distinction between the two right now really comes from the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the gross domestic product does not include transfer payments from government. And in this pandemic, when we locked down the economy, our policymakers recognize that we really need to support this economy, including the ability of households that had been ordered not to go to work to keep body and soul together, to be able to buy food, to be able to pay the rent, and so on and so forth. So we had legislation that provided benefits from government, transfer payments from government, well beyond the scale to which we have been accustomed and beyond the scale that had been paid before the pandemic hit us in the beginning of this year. A lot of that came through, for example, unemployment compensation. And one of the worries that we have now is where that's going. So people were spending beyond what they were producing, spending beyond the income that they earned in the marketplace, but not beyond the cash income that they received in transfer payments from government. And the worrying thing right now is that at the end of July, the unemployment compensation benefits that had been greatly increased to try to make up for the hit on the economy from the pandemic, those benefits have been cut substantially. The increases have expired. And as a result, one of the things we're going to have to worry about looking forward is, will those retail sales hold on when the incomes of consumers have declined as much as they have since the end of last month?
So I think part of the picture you're painting for us, Joe, right, is this idea that, well, the government did all this stuff, like, for example, sending out stimulus checks to the majority of Americans. So the picture of retail sales doesn't necessarily match what the economy itself is doing, because these people got money that we don't actually even look at when we're talking about GDP. So there's this mismatch between they had money to spend that they wouldn't have had if the government necessarily hadn't stepped in. So they're spending this money, and now the question is, the government's not doing that, and you still have a lot of people out of work. So now what happens to retail sales? Is that fair synopsis of what you just said?
Yes, it is. You asked a moment ago, or Lance asked a moment, whether people were spending money that they didn't have. As a society, we were spending money that we didn't produce, or that we didn't earn. The government, the federal government, was borrowing money for us at an extraordinary rate. The reason for doing that was to keep the economy on its feet. We don't want to fall into the kind of a downturn that we had in the Great Depression. And, weakness feeds on weakness. If people aren't going to the grocery store isn't ordering food from the farmers can't buy the feed and supplies that they need, and it just goes on and on. It cascades and it gets worse and worse. So we're in an extraordinary time. The federal government is borrowing extraordinary amounts of money. It's necessary at this time to keep the economy on its feet. When the patient in the hospital and he's suffering from cancer, you don't tell him to go home and go on a diet because he's also overweight. We've got to deal with a potentially fatal problem that we have right now, or at least very serious problem. But at the end of the day, after we address this issue of keeping the economy going, keeping households to get children fed, the rent being paid, we are going to have to make adjustments to make up for all the borrowing we had to do to keep the economy going.
This is all part of what people are feeling too, because as we know, that plays a big role on how the economy does. And recent research shows us that anxiety is up across all age groups, which is understandable given the state of the world, but particularly for young people. In these very uncertain times, what do you see, Joe, from your experience? What do you see on the horizon, both in the near term over the next few months and over the next several years? Is there a hope for return to normalcy? What should we expect as consumers, as people in the workforce, as retirees?
Really can't say what I would expect from experience, because I've never seen anything like this. And I've been around longer than I'd like to admit. This is the worst economic downturn, beyond question. This is the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And of course, we were saying that in the financial crisis of 2008. So here we are, we've taken a second body blow. What is this likely to do to us going forward? There's going to be a lot of dislocation. It's going to be very unfortunate for folks have just graduated from school, for example. The worst case situation, you got your diploma last year, you're just beginning to get your footing in the job market. And now all of a sudden, you have this extraordinary economic weakness and businesses laying people off. That's kind of the worst of all possible worlds. What we need to do as a society is to keep this economy on its feet. A lot of it is going to boil to what our healthcare sector, particularly the research and the pharmaceutical part of the healthcare industry, can do to block off this pandemic and get us back to the point where people can go back to work safely. This is going to be an extraordinary time. We're pushing our healthcare providers, away to the breaking point, and you have to thank them for all the work that they've done. It's not only the people who are dealing with patients, it's also the people who are working with us, the pharmaceuticals, the vaccines, and the palliatives to deal with this pandemic and give us the opportunity to go back to work safely. That's what we're going to have as we go forward.
We'll paint the glass half full here, and we'll say, okay, so economic disasters maybe not on the horizon. We may weather this storm a little bit, but down deep, everybody wants to feel financially secure. Do you think maybe that the drug companies are the key for us feeling that way during these uncertain times? Or do you think that or is there another key that we need to focus on so that we can try to feel a little bit better about the future? Are there things that we should watch?
Well, the healthcare sector as a whole is certainly extremely important. The pharmaceutical companies are very important of that. But another thing to think about is our healthcare providers more broadly. Over time, the mortality rate from this virus has been falling in the sense that people who have gone into the hospital recently had a better probability of walking out of the hospital than they did in the early days of the virus. So all of our healthcare providers have been learning how to deal with this problem, and thank God for that. Beyond that, the whole business sector has got to find a way to keep businesses on their feet. That includes our policymakers. We had to respond to the onset of the pandemic very quickly. We're coming around to the need to renew the legislation that began the process, in part because when all of this started, we assumed that this pandemic was going to go away a lot faster than it, in fact, has done. One of the things that is troubling here is how long this virus has continued going, and that's really part of the scary part here. So in terms of economic policymakers, they have got to learn different ways to keep businesses going. Businesses have got to find ways to change their business models. One of the things that's going on is restaurants and retail stores delivering to you at curbside so that you don't have to go into the store and you can purchase safely. So that's an important part, is learning to develop business models to operate in this environment. And that's going to have to go on further as we proceed.
So, Joe, I'm going to ask you something, because we're big on the State of Us about practical things for our people at home, right? Because we've shared a lot of information. I think people have a better idea of what's going on, why it's so significant. We've done a good job of breaking all that down, or rather, at least you have. And now we want to talk a little bit about, there's kind of three different areas that we're focused on, right? People who are entering the workforce, whether they're out of college, out of high school, whatever it may be. People that already have a career, and then also people that are either moving into retirement or are already in retirement. For each of these people, and I understand the question, you may have to answer it differently for each one, what can they do at home, right? Because a lot of this is, it's on the government, it's on business, it's on everybody but them, and they're feeling anxious because it's like, well, what can I do to make my situation maybe a little better, or at least a little safer? What can I be doing to plan for the future, whether it's good or bad? So what would you say to them, respectively, each of those groups?
For people who are starting to get traction in a career or are trying to in this environment, the one thing I think that we can offer at this point is the confidence that from the experience of this country, and again, as I've said, it's not within our lifetimes, but go back to the Great Depression. We have found ways to get through these difficulties. Economic policy making in the financial crisis and now in this pandemic has been far superior than it was at the time of the Great Depression. We are going to get out of this. It is extremely important that we put this pandemic down. So to everybody, I would say, behave in a socially responsible fashion. A mask is not a political statement. It is protecting the people around you, and also to an extent yourself. And we all ought to be realistic and to look at this situation in a scientific and a fact-based way. For people who are trying to start a career, we've got to look for ways to make businesses work today. And I can only say that for all the hard times today, people have got to persevere to try to find ways to get their footing in the labor market, to find ways to get to work. For people who are in mid-career, if you're fortunate enough to be able to continue to work, I think we've all got to think about the folks around us who are not as fortunate as we are. Once we do get our footing, I hope that we don't have through an experience like this again. But once the economy gets going again, I think a lesson for each of us, as it is for government, is you've got to be prepared.
Let me ask there, because you mentioned something, and I was thinking this as you were speaking. When you say prepared for the bad times, because people go back and forth on this when we're in a situation like we're in right now. And I know different economists say different things. Some people may take that approach of, don't go out and buy anything that you don't need, right? Save all the money that you can, keep it all back. Quit discretionary spending. Don't do any of that. And then other people are taking that approach of live life like we always have, keep investing in the stock market, keep going out and buying, improving your home, whatever it may be. Go get that new TV that you want if your finances allow it. What should people be doing there? I mean, what's that? Is it, conserve a little bit and hold back, or is it keep living life and trying to make the best of it?
Financial advisors, financial planners generally tell people that you want to have a reserve. The reserve is, you typically state it as somewhere between 1 month and 3 months worth of income. That's probably a reasonable place to be. And if you are in a situation where you have the opportunity to build up that kind of a reserve, I think that's what most advisors would say. Once you've done that, you certainly prepare for retirement, but you also want to participate in the economy. You want to live a satisfying life, and that's been a part of the way that this economy has built itself. The guidance I think that people want to keep in mind is you don't want to be walking on the edge. You want to have a margin of safety. But once you build up that margin of safety, you can be somewhat more comfortable. And I think everybody wants to do that. When you get to the population of people who are retired, fortunately, in this environment, the financial markets have come back. That's been for a number of reasons. Part of it is that people have been optimistic about where the economy is going. Part of it has been because the Federal Reserve has been supplying the financial markets with a lot of it to try to keep the economy going and to try to keep financial institutions sound. So to this point, retirees have done fairly well, and they probably will continue to do so. Again, the notion is you don't want to be too close to the edge. You want to be sure that you have a reserve to protect yourself.
Very good. Joe's given us, folks, a lot of things to talk about and to think about. And in the next segment, Justin and I are going to talk about what we have learned today and how might these observations better inform our conversations about today's leaders, because we do have an election coming up as well. Those are the things that Justin and I will discuss in the next segment of the show. But Joe, first, we appreciate you taking some time to speak with Justin and me.
Thanks very much for having. It's been a good time. I appreciate it.
Always appreciate having Joe on the show. He's got that experience and insight, and one of those, I think, that Lance and I value so much, which is that practical approach to things, less interested in the partisan nature and more interested in what can be done. And that speaks to the organization that he works at. And to learn more about the Committee for Economic Development, you can visit their website, ced.org. They have been around quite a long time, and they're a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that's been working to provide public policy solutions to some of the nation's biggest economic challenges. How can we use what we've learned today, and how might these observations better inform our conversations about today's leaders? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
Today we had the opportunity to talk about how retail sales have been painting a kind of confusing picture. Lance and I got to break that down in the first segment of today's program. And then in the second segment, we were fortunate enough to get to speak with Joe Minarik. He is the former chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget during the Clinton administration, and he served in a number of other roles that are pretty valuable that lend all this experience to the current situation. But even he said, Lance, and I think this is telling, one of my takeaways, right, is that even as old as he is, we've not been through something like what we're going through with anybody that's alive. Okay. It's not that we've never been through anything like this as a nation, but never with anybody that's alive today. And so it does make it different because you don't have that firsthand experience like you do with some other stuff that we go through where you can lean on those older people, right? Those people with more experience who have seen this stuff. So, it is definitely a different situation. And the other takeaway, and this is probably perhaps the one that I feel the most strongly about, Lance, is we've definitely got a situation where people think about, what am I going to do with my money, right? What do I do in this uncertain time? Do I go out and spend it? Do I save it? And Joe's answer, I think, is telling, because basically what he told us is you should be doing what's always advised. And if you haven't been doing that, then you should probably start doing it. And that's 1 to 3 months, right, of income set aside. And that can be really tough for people, Lance, because we know that most Americans don't have that much set aside. We know that most Americans don't have $500, on hand as an emergency fund. So when you're thinking about, do I go out and buy stuff, which the economy needs you to do, now is a perfect time, rather than do some of that discretionary stuff possibly, to say, let's make sure that I'm in a situation where if the government isn't ready to help me, I'm ready to help myself. And I know that those aren't Joe's exact words, and I'm not saying that's what he said, but that's what I take from it, is we need to keep doing what we usually would do. But if you haven't previously had that stuff set aside, do it now. Work towards it. Because again, if you have nothing set aside and you can get up to 500 set aside, that's 500% better than it was before. So even if you can't get to 1 to 3 months of total income set aside, because that is a decent amount of money for people, especially with a crisis or if you're out of work, try to get something set aside, because anything will be better than nothing, and you'll be thankful that you have it if we get into a situation where our lawmakers, kind of like they are right now, are dragging their feet with kind of what's next, right? So I think that's for me, that was the key takeaway for what our audience needs to hear.
It's not going to happen quickly. So when you're talking about 1 to 3 months, it may take you 6 to 9 months or a year to get that money set aside. So don't get frustrated if things happen, all of a sudden, oh man, I got to buy 2 new tires because, winter's coming or something here in the Northeast, and I need some good tread on my back end or my front end to get through the snow. But like you said, start it. My big takeaway, and this is the policy wonk side of me, was him explaining why we see the difference in retail growth so much more than we did the GDP, and that being the stimulus money and the extra $600 that people got wasn't counted in the GDP, because as defined, the GDP doesn't count that money as
we just borrowed
real production. We didn't produce anything. When I got my stimulus check and my wife got a stimulus check, we didn't do anything for that money except breathing. My mom used to call that to the grandkids breathing money. She'd just hand them a $20 bill and say, that's breathing money from grandma. We all got some breathing money that we were able to spend, which helped retail sales, but didn't show the GDP. So that kind of explained to me in a very short, succinct way. I know a lot more goes into it than that, but that was a very brief explanation that made sense to me. The other piece was your first one. And as the historian, the Great Depression scenario is one that I just keep thinking about. And, I know that for many people, if they understood or remembered anything from class when they were in high school about the Great Depression, is it was a tough time and there were all kinds of government programs. And then the scenario that most people remember is, oh yeah, and World War II brought us out. Well, it wasn't World War II. It was the fact that World War II created jobs. So jobs are the key to getting the economy back. But then you also have to understand there was pent up demand for supplies. So inflation went up. The tax rate was different, especially the corporate tax rate was different in the mid 40s and early 50s to get us going after the Great Depression. So I agree with Joe that we haven't seen anything like this in our lifetimes. It's the worst since the Great Depression, but there needs to be a greater study of how the United States came out of the Great Depression and became so strong economically rather than just say, well, World War II, because too many people then want to say, well, all we need is a war, we'll create jobs and we'll all be good. And there was a lot done after World War II because we were in massive debt to pay off that debt. And so we're kind of in that same situation now. So that may be another show, but those were my two takeaways from the show. So I agree with you with the one about the Great Depression.
Yeah. I mean, it's always hard when we look at something like this. And actually, I was going to tell you, Lance, I saw this article. It was just front page of the Wall Street Journal the other day, kind of an analysis about how we approached COVID and why the approach failed. In other words, what was the problem and why is the United States faring the way it is? Where certain other countries saw better success, why were we behind? And one of those had to do, I think the biggest thing had to do with the hodgepodge approach that we had. We switched directions too many times because the article makes the point, if you take the morality out of everything, right? If we had stuck with either approach, and there was a better approach than either of the ones that we tried, but the first approach was kind of don't do anything really, right? I mean, just, let it go and that is what it is. But the other approach, was then shut down. And because we kind of went back and forth and now we're back to the other one, if you don't stick with either, neither of them work very well.
Exactly.
And that was a big takeaway. I think the theme overall is we got to stick with something and keep moving. And from a personal level, you have to do the same. Make sure you've got a philosophy and that you and your family are on the same page about how you're going to approach this.
Stay consistent. Don't go after the flavor of the month.
That's right.
If you can set aside $50 a month or $10 a week or whatever it is, just stay on that road and eventually you'll get there. Don't try the latest thing that comes down. But, as you always say, we have a mission here at True Chat, and that's to try to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And that's what we've done today, where we had a conversation about the economy and how it affects people and what they need to do to try to make it better for themselves and for all of us. So please, if you can, the key is to get the word out. So share it with your family and friends. Tell them you listened. And if they say, well, that sounds kind of interesting, I'd like to listen to that. Well, then make sure you tell them that they can find The State of Us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere podcasts are found.
For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our guest today, Joe Minarik from the Committee for Economic Development. Always a pleasure to have him on. And as always, a big thank you to our recording producer, Devin McCain, and our editing producer, Bradley Butch, for getting this put together for all of you. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.